Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the penultimate session of this year's Halifax International Security Forum. As you know, we don't mess around, we get straight into the discussion. So I'm going to introduce Ms. Mercedes Stevenson, a reporter from CTV Canada, who will be our moderator this morning. And as usual, just before we go to the panel, on the discussion of My Kind of NATO, Chicago 2012, we'll have a short video.
This is the Palais de Chaillot in Paris, headquarters of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. To this building come ministers from 15 nations of the Atlantic community. They speak different languages, have different cultural backgrounds. The countries they represent vary in size from very small to very large. But here, all distinctions fade. All the languages become one, the language of hope.
The NATO-led peacekeeping operation in Kosovo began in June 1999. The Kosovo Force, or KFOR, initially included some 40,000 soldiers. They were deployed following a 78-day aerial campaign aimed at putting an end to the ethnic cleansing of civilians in Kosovo. The objective remains the same, namely to maintain a stable and secure environment that enables all citizens of whatever ethnic origin to live in a peaceful and democratic Kosovo.
NATO's Secretary General in Belgium is calling their months-long bombing campaign a positive story, showcasing the commitment of the alliance's European members, saying it's the first time in the alliance's history that European members in Canada, rather than the United States, provided the majority of military assets in such an operation.
They have the time of their life.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. It is my distinct honor and pleasure to have the opportunity to moderate this panel and to see so many of our fine men and women in uniform joining us. Thank you for your service this morning. To see politicians from so many different countries and defense ministers who are taking our security very seriously and joining us at the Halifax conference, people from industry, people from all around the world who work in the defense and security sector, as well as industry, academia, so many different sectors, so many fascinating people here and fascinating discussions. And we look forward to having yet another one this morning on a topic that we haven't talked about at all so far in this conference, NATO. So we will be having a very different kind of discussion this morning, which will incorporate, I think, many of the themes that we've already heard about and some new ones, talking about NATO and the Chicago Summit. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you our panelists, starting with Mr. James Apatharai. He is the Deputy Assistant Secretary General. He said I should put the emphasis on the Secretary General part of that, for Political Affairs of NATO. Minister Gerald Howarth, Minister for International Security Strategy of the United Kingdom, and Mr. Bruce Jackson, President of the Project on Transitional Democracies. So a fantastic panel today. I'd like to start with you, James. James, we have the NATO summit in Chicago coming up in less than a year. What does success look like to you at that summit?
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me. We'll go to the summit, I think, with quite some confidence, and you already heard many of the reasons why. Yesterday, Libya, I think, gave the organization quite a boost. It seems like the slogan for why NATO is going to be successful is that there's no one else, and that's not the greatest tagline. I was reminded of the Ricky Gervais movie where he lives in a world where everybody has to tell the truth, and the slogan for Pepsi is Pepsi when they don't have Coke. I like Pepsi, so no offense to Pepsi, but there is no Pepsi in this case. And to be more pragmatic about it, what Libya showed us was that when it comes even to commanding an operation of that size, there's no other door to knock on. So it worked, and NATO demonstrated its capability, so we'll go in with some confidence. Second, I think we'll go in with confidence because of the way in which the organization is evolving. And I'll disagree slightly with Dr. Fox. It's never a good idea for a civil servant to disagree with the politician, but I'll do it this one time. I think we see that Libya showed that the balance of leadership in the organization is evolving. Yes, some nations led in Libya, but at the same time, they were all in Afghanistan under a US lead. And at the same time, Germany was deploying combat troops into Kosovo, where things were getting very difficult. In a big organization with lots of far-flung operations, this is, I think, the way in which NATO will evolve. And the third reason, and this will come up in Chicago as well, is that we've seen how NATO's partnerships have now become very important to us, very important to our partners, and they work. We had 3 Arab countries, 1 European country participating with us. It was really plug and play, decision-making and militarily. They just came, they plugged in, and they were there. We worked very closely with the UN in a way we never did before, and with the European Union. So the partnerships that NATO has now, forged in Afghanistan, have totally changed the organization. It's really not your dad's NATO anymore. But of course, capabilities will be a big discussion in Chicago. A success for us would be success for General Abrial, and that is to lay out a blueprint to which allies sign up, to set out a way forward to manage the differing approaches to defense cuts. But I think we also should have some confidence about what Afghanistan has meant for NATO. Afghanistan has been the crucible of, I would suggest, the greatest single period of improvement in NATO forces that the alliance has ever seen. They can work together in a way that they never could before, and with partners as well. The technology, the doctrine, everything has evolved at super fast pace. And these forces will be coming back. Their capabilities will be coming back. And by the way, the money we're spending there will be coming back. So I think in a few years, we'll be in a good position there. I mentioned multinational defense. In essence, the smart defense, the secret to that will be political commitment. Finally, I think one of the, 2 points. One is missile defense. We will declare initial operating capability at the summit, and that will be, I think, a success for us. But I think a narrative, and I'll conclude with this, at the summit and beyond will be the relationship between the US and Europe. The US will be pulling some troops out of Europe, but at the same time building missile defense with the Europeans. So there is some glue being strengthened, even as other ties maybe are seen to be diminished. But what's very, very important for the alliance, and I'll stop there, is that the 2 sides of the Atlantic remain bonded. We discussed this a little bit yesterday, and I think it's important to remember that Europe has been at peace for 70 years, not least because of the political and military presence of the United States in Europe. That is a lesson of history we cannot forget, and we should not forget, even in a time of budgetary cuts.
Minister, I want to go to you next. As a country who has contributed heavily in Afghanistan and again in Libya, are you equally as confident going into Chicago that it will be just that easy?
Well, I don't think it'll be easy at all. I ought to start off by saying that, of course, like James, I couldn't possibly disagree with Dr. Fox either, because he was my boss. But since he's here today and he's not currently my boss, I can probably afford to take a little bit more of an independent stance. But as it happens, he and I are joined at the hip anyway, so it doesn't really matter. So I share his concerns, but I'll start off with a point of agreement with James. I think that it's entirely true that maintaining the transatlantic nature of this alliance is absolutely imperative. North America and Europe do need to be bonded, but we, whilst Libya, I think, has been an astonishingly successful operation in terms of NATO, and who else was going to stand up in 6 days and deliver the United Nations mandate? Who was going to execute the United Nations mandate? And I think it's a phenomenal tribute to NATO that the Secretary General and General Bouchard were able to put this team together in such a short space of time. And I don't think we've made enough of this to the public who pay the taxes which fund NATO. And I think we should make much more of it. I think it's been very successful. But equally, I think that going into Chicago next year, we have to be very realistic. In the past 3 years, the European members of NATO have cut their defense budgets by 24 billion euros. As I'm personally not a particular fan of the euro, I don't quite know how much that means in real money. And for those of you who are in doubt, I'm wearing my sterling cufflinks, which I have worn throughout the last 15 years. It's a sign of independence that we were not going to join the folly of the euro. But it's a lot of money. 24 billion euros is still a lot of money. And we see in the United States as well an unfolding drama there in terms of the $500 billion defense cut at the moment. And if the super committee does not achieve next week, then this drama will continue to unfold. So we have to be realistic about Chicago next year that, yes, Libya, I think, has given a real impetus to NATO, building on Afghanistan. We have to remember as well that the fundamental reason why the alliance came into being was Article 5. We should never lose sight of that fact. And if you go to Poland, I can assure you, you're not allowed to lose sight of that fact. But Article 5 is the bedrock. I remember after the fall of the Berlin Wall, all the skeptics said that there's no future role for NATO. Well, I think that that has been proved incorrect. I think Afghanistan and Libya have shown that NATO does have a role. But I think the members of NATO have really got to make some pretty tough decisions. You cannot leave it all up to the United States and a hardcore of nations to bear the weight, which is what Liam was saying yesterday. It used to be the case that the balance was split pretty evenly between the United States and Europe. It's now 75% of the budget of NATO is carried by the United States and 25% by the Europeans. And people have choices. Despite the economic circumstances, at the end of the day, all governments are spending a huge amount of money, and it's a question of priorities. So I think that that is going to be a major challenge. I think getting the structure of NATO right, getting NATO much more efficient, its command structure much leaner, is going to be a challenge for next year. But above all, the commitment of the members to want to play their part in ensuring that NATO is able to continue to deliver without relying disproportionately on a small number of members.
I'm going to go to you now, Bruce. I have a feeling that you may want to address a question of political will, which has been maybe not quite as critically addressed by the other two members of the panel. Do you think that it's even possible at Chicago to achieve the kind of balance that's required?
Well, not trying to take anything away from James's correct characterization of Libya, which was a great success for the alliance and should be commended, I still think we can raise some tough questions in Chicago. Warren Buffett said about this period of recession that when the tide goes out, you get to see who's swimming naked. And I think that that's something we should talk about. It seems to me when we look at, say, the Greek budget numbers or the Lehman Brothers risk management, we should also look just as hard at the self-evaluation of NATO evaluating its own performance. I think that there are standard questions, corporate entities or international organizations, where we ask a series of questions which are supposed to be tough, and I think they need to be addressed in Chicago. One is the question of membership. I think it's well known that NATO's membership process crashed and burned at the Bucharest summit in 2008, and we have not recovered that skill as yet. We are actually actively discouraging Montenegro, who is qualified, from applying in Chicago. I thought the policy was to complete the Balkans as soon as possible, not to discourage people from matriculating from the Balkans. So it seems to me that's a little reversed. Secondly, I think it's a normal question to ask about management. There was a lot of discussion last night about unelected European leaders making decisions and the question of their legitimacy. Well, the last Secretary General, the current Secretary General, was chosen by an unelected American official. That's not a transparent process. It's unusual, and we've got to one thing at Chicago is to talk about succession planning. The next Secretary General is going to have huge budgetary competence, and essentially it's not out of the question to think about the NATO of the future in terms of the restructuring the United States did after Vietnam. I mean, it's going to be a massive job. And I think thirdly is the question of the mission itself. a lot of times you get the impression talking to NATO that whatever was in the paper today is NATO's new mission, whether it's cyber warfare, pirates in Somalia, or et cetera, et cetera. It seems to me that there are core competencies that we ask about. What is the response to the Balkans? What is the response to South Caucasus? Where are the contingency plans for the Baltics? What are we doing with Ukraine in the East? And those are not missions you choose for yourself. Those are missions that European security organizations are supposed to do. But every day you hear NATO has a new mission or discovered a new role. That seems to me you need to have the shareholders vote on that and agree that that's the vote. And it seems to me and I fault the United States in this, the agenda for Chicago is what we're not going to discuss because it would be awkward. I don't think organizations become excellent by finding things they're not going to discuss. I think we need to push hard and have an eventful summit and substantive summit in Chicago.
I'm going to turn it over to the room at this point. See questions? Yes, right there in the center, please. Dr. Berkeson. And I'd ask you to just identify yourself, please, and where you're from so we all know.
David Berkeson from Calgary. In his recent memoir, our former Chief of the Defense Staff, General Rick Hillier, had a lot of experience standing up ISAF in Kabul and the overseeing of the movement of Canadian troops to Kandahar. I can't quote him exactly, but he excoriated NATO for its operations in Afghanistan. He mentioned, among other things, policy failures, failures of leadership, inconsistencies, problems with equipment, operational issues, just about everything that you could name. In the course of my own work, I've spoken to a few Canadian officers who served in Afghanistan at the battalion and the brigade level, and their views of NATO are just about the same today as Rick Hillier's are. So there seems clearly to be something wrong, and NATO's, I think, got a lot of problems it has to deal with operationally, but I don't see anybody really discussing these things seriously as I think they ought to.
I suppose
James.
that was directed at me, huh? Yeah.
It was a comment to everyone.
First, I guess being excoriated by Rick Hillier doesn't put NATO in the minority because he has strong views, and I respect him. He also said, as I recall, that no organization, no country needs NATO more than Canada does. And actually, I share that view in a certain way. But of course, there are legitimate concerns about the way the operation in Afghanistan is run, and we're learning as we go. I don't think anybody should be surprised by that. Nothing like this has ever been done before, and it's halfway around the world in a landlocked country in an almost impossible physical environment and a very complicated political environment. So yes, we're learning as we go, and I wouldn't say that everything was done right. That being said, I would not share the view that it's not being looked at and not being changed. In fact, what you can see through the evolution of this operation is precisely that the strategy has been honed, the strategy has been changed. General McChrystal, of course, had the most obvious major policy adjustment. But the operational lessons are being learned all the time. And in fact, the effectiveness of this operation has gone up substantially in the last 2 or 3 years, and statistically you can measure in the last year how much it has improved. The number of attacks month on month, based on our calculations, not the UN, but the UN calculates in a different way, if you compare it to last year, are down very substantially. The amount of territory which is being led by Afghan security forces will be up to 50% in the coming months. So we can clearly demonstrate that things are getting better, and we're into a transition process, as you know. So I don't want to say everything's perfect. It's not. I don't want to say that we haven't had to adjust, because we have, and we're still adjusting. But I wouldn't say excoriated is probably the right word to use for that mission.
I'm going to take a couple of questions and then bring them back to our panel, and I'll keep track of them. Yeah, absolutely, please.
An observation that it is extraordinary how loquacious generals become once they cease to be in uniform. I once said that I had no doubt that the generals were prepared to lay down their lives for their country, but I wasn't entirely convinced they were prepared to lay down their pensions for their principles. I got a lot of tax for that, but think about it, folks. Just think about it. And I'd like to support James, and I've been out to Afghanistan 5 times. It is an immensely difficult operation at a whole series of levels. And I think that what we are seeing now is a really substantial military advance. I'm not going to use the word success, but I came away in February, as long ago as February, trying to suppress my sense of optimism. But talking to the guys, I think that the investment that's been made, both up front in terms of the United States surge, and nobody should be under any illusions about the impact of the US surge. Last, the right number of people were deployed into theater. But also a huge amount of work that's been going on at a less visible level. I think has achieved some pretty substantial military results. The issue now is, of course, governance. And the Karzai government now has to understand they have got 2 and a bit years to get themselves sorted out, 3 years to get themselves sorted out and be in a position to run the country. They have been given the most amazing start, in my view. And of course, in some parts of Helmand, in Helmand in particular, where Governor Mangle has really taken up the cudgels and run with it, it's been so far successful. But it's over to the politicians in Kabul. Eventually, they're going to have to take control. They need to start thinking about that now.
Yes, up here, the purple microphone. No? Okay, sorry, I thought there was someone who had their hand up there. But okay, let's go over here then.
Thank you. Anne Penketh from BASIC, British American Security Information Council. I'd like to follow up on your point about the lack of transparency, because I think that is an issue for NATO. As you know, there are serious policy differences going on over the nuclear issue in the context of the Deterrence and Defence Posture Review. Now, this is the NATO equivalent of the Obama administration's NPR, the Nuclear Posture Review, which was released in its entirety. Can you promise that the NATO equivalent will be released at the Chicago summit? And if not, why not?
Oh, I suppose that's for me again. Actually, I have no answer. I don't know if there's been any discussion on publicizing the posture review or not. So sorry, I wish I could, and I don't want to defend the decision not to until I know that we're not going to. So I'll just stop there.
Great. We have a question over here.
Thank you very much. Paul Cornish from the United Kingdom. It's a question about Article 5 of the treaty. I think for all 3 of the panelists, actually. Article 5 is often known as the Three Musketeers commitment, one for all and all for one. But of course, it's not really as straightforward as that. It's not necessarily an immediate commitment. It's a political decision to invoke Article 5, and neither is it necessarily a military response. Unlike the Brussels Treaty, which preceded the NATO Treaty, as we all know, the NATO Article 5 is a bit more nuanced, so there can be different sorts of response to a crisis. But my question is, how meaningful is Article 5 nowadays? Is it becoming more of a political than a military commitment, as it were? And particularly, and I think this is for Bruce Jackson, if we are to get back into the business of expanding or enlarging NATO and taking on more and more of the Balkans and so on, then does Article 5 become even less meaningful? Does it become even less meaningful in terms of a military response? Does it become more of a political, response than possibly a military one?
Let's take one more question from over here, and then we'll go right back. There's one right there. Yes, go ahead.
Bruce Weinrod, Washington, D.C. It's kind of a comment and a question as well. On Bruce Jackson's comment, I know how strongly you feel and have been involved in the NATO expansion, but I would really disagree on the crashing and burning in Bucharest. President Bush actually insisted that the heads of state and government continue their debate and discussions on this much longer than this. Rarely do they actually get into substance at these meetings. It's all pre-programmed. It went on till the next day, didn't get membership, but they did get a statement that they will become members, Georgia and Ukraine, someday. And believe me, given the strong opposition of certain allies to this concept, it was, I think, a major achievement. So I would just add that as a footnote to what you said. On the NATO Secretary General as a manager, I think Secretary Gates said this on a number of occasions, that NATO needed a CEO as a Secretary General, so he certainly pushed that. At the end of the day, you have a number of nations that get involved. Maybe it should be more transparent. That would be fine. On NATO's missions, well, that's an interesting area. NATO has taken on missions because it's the only organization that really has the military capability to do that, and if they're asked to do it, should they decline? They take on some that are maybe for the future. For example, energy security. They didn't just take it on because it was in the paper one day. This was actually a debate at NATO that went on for years. Certain countries didn't even want the term energy security to be mentioned at NATO until using the term disruption of the flow of vital energy resources was all that could be said. But eventually, NATO did decide to take this on as a mission. Does that mean they're going to go all around the world? No, but it does mean that there are a number of countries that could be affected, their vital interests could be affected by disruption of energy resources, and why not have NATO at least be prepared on the military side, not on the economic side, to be involved. Cyber defense, same thing. It's a very limited role, defending NATO's capabilities. That's reasonable, et cetera. The last point is, it relates to the Partners Program, which James mentioned, and what NATO has really become in the last few years, for better or for worse, I think is better, is a global security forum and a global security network, which means that there are nations from all around the world that come to Brussels, come to the summits, and meet and discuss these security issues. And NATO is beginning to take advantage and needs to take more advantage in terms of capabilities and resources with a lot of countries that can provide them either through their existing capabilities, such as Sweden and Finland, which have been involved in NATO operations, or countries through training and education can be raised to NATO standards for involvement in NATO military operations. So I think it's a good thing that NATO has, in effect, gone global in this regard, not as a global policeman, but as a global security network, and I hope that will continue. Thank you.
Bruce, do you want to start first, since you had two questions there?
Well, just to pick up on my friend Bruce Weinrod's, yes, I am more critical about the NATO, the membership process. I do think it's the most powerful tool that NATO has, and I think it's foolish not to use it. The decision at Bucharest was not about membership. It was about a membership action plan, which was to qualify them. If NATO wants to go around promising that people will go to Harvard, but won't allow them to go to high school, it's a little contradiction. I mean, clearly it would be far better to have put them into an action plan to improve their credentials than to guarantee them in a teleological sense that they're going to become members at the end of time. This speaks sort of to the possible dilution of Article 5. Look, Article 5 is nothing more than an indication to our enemies and potential adversaries of what we care about and we value. It's not a commitment to go to war, it's a commitment to consider. And we are just making it clearer for other people what the West stands for and where we will stand. And this kind of clarity is thought to be a good thing. When we couldn't clarify at Bucharest whether Georgia was in or out, there happened to be a war there 5 months later. Is there a correlation? I don't know. The last time we didn't want to discuss Montenegro was at Versailles. It wasn't a good next 60 or 70 years. So we should be clear when people show up and say, we believe we share your values, we want to share your responsibilities. They need to be heard. And we need to discuss this. Montenegro is not asking for membership at Chicago. It's asked to be discussed of how they're doing in the membership action plan. And frankly, we only have one candidate that wants to be in this alliance. And that's 700,000 people. Boy, I'd like to have a queue of lots of countries that want to join this alliance. I mean, I think that makes us stronger and more effective.
I'm afraid I don't share that view, I'm afraid, Bruce. I think the larger the organization, the more difficult it becomes to manage, the more difficult it becomes to agree the common purpose. And what Article 5 does is it provides the common purpose. And the general understanding, whatever the nuances are, the general understanding is that an attack on one is an attack on all. And if Georgia had been a member, I do think you have to make a calculation as to what would we have done and what would have been the consequences of not having done anything. And it may be that that we should kind of downgrade Article 5 and make it clear that it isn't cast in stone, that it's, you know, well, we just see if we might regard it as an invasion or not, and look at a greater membership, a broader membership, to achieve a different purpose. But I would suggest that is a very, very big decision, and I personally would be of the view that Article 5 has to be at the very core of NATO, and that we adjust our missions around that core. And I think there's one thing that James mentioned earlier, which I think is worth bearing in mind, and perhaps there ought to be greater transparency on that, and that's BMD, ballistic missile defense. The fact is that none of my constituents are protected from ballistic missile attack, and I think it's one area where NATO really can deliver a capability on behalf of all, and I think it's an extremely important program, one which I personally happen to support very strongly indeed.
I'd make 3 quick points. One, to respond to you, Bruce, if I could, on enlargement. I don't think the picture that you're portraying is necessarily the full one, at least from my point of view. One is that, as I'm sure you know very well, Bosnia has been brought into the membership action plan. They just need to turn the key by doing something they haven't yet been able to do, but certainly the willingness is there on our part. And as you mentioned, Montenegro, and as you heard, both Georgia and Ukraine, as you know very well, were told that they will become NATO members if they still want to and when they meet the standards. But it wasn't just a statement. They both have commissions, they both have annual national programs which set out all the areas they need, they wish, and we can help them to reform. And those areas of reform look a lot like the areas that would prepare you for membership, even if the word isn't there. And we go through these annual cycles of review and we help them. So there is a mechanism attached. And we share the view that NATO's door has to remain open. That is absolutely clear. On a possible democratic deficit, I must say at NATO I really don't see that. NATO is a pure intergovernmental body. There is no supranational body, there is no commission, there is no qualified majority voting to do anything. All the governments have to agree at the table, which is not always the most pleasant process. For example, which water glasses should we purchase? We have a committee. We have a lot of committees. We have an underwater diving committee. We have a pipeline committee. We have a lot of good committees. That's the result of the democratic process that we have in NATO. And all those missions that you mentioned, from cyber to energy security, I mean, these were all debated. These were all approved by them in the strategic concept. So as far as work, which is published, by the way. So from our point of view, we think we're doing our democratic duty.
Laurie Hahn.
Thank you. Laurie Hahn, Member of Parliament for Edmonton. I'd like to explore the political side of NATO a little bit more versus the military side. We've had military successes in NATO. Those are clear. I think as we go forward, the political dimension of NATO in terms of developing governance and so on in other countries can be more important, partly because the military side is becoming less and less affordable in the short term. So I'm interested in what you might see as coming out of Chicago and beyond in terms of developing NATO's multinational, multilateral capacity to develop democratic reforms in places like Afghanistan currently or others, using our capacity for democracy within NATO to develop that capacity in other countries.
And we actually have another gentleman with a question right next to Laurie. Please go ahead.
Christopher Marshall from the German Daily Der Tagesspiegel. During this forum, I have heard complaints, which I had always heard, burden sharing and so on. Not everybody is aboard when we need the capacities and so on. But somehow I think the mood changed. To my impression, there were more heartfelt complaints that countries are using the advantages of NATO without paying the premium, the insurance premium. Do we need to change the mechanisms? On one hand, it is the beauty of NATO that everybody can agree without making absolute commitment. Article 5, you can vote for Article 5 without making a contribution. It's up to a nation whether they want to take part, in which degree they want to take part. Libya, we could come to an agreement that NATO want to act in Libya. If there would be a commitment for everybody who votes yes, probably we haven't had a Libya action, and so on. And now my question is there the feeling that this doesn't work anymore? Do we need a sort of sanction for people who want to be part of NATO but don't want to contribute when it comes to heartfelt and necessary cases? And if so, are you willing to pay the price? Then there would be probably less cases where we would agree to take common action. Thank you.
So the question first about Afghanistan, and then on whether or not we should perhaps have a more coercive process.
I think that the idea of developing democracy is not something that should be laid at NATO's door, Frank. It might be a political organization, but it's overwhelmingly also a military organization. And I think there's a lot of countries around the world, which don't quite match up to our sense of democracy. I've got my own personal list, which is rather different from other people's. I do have the former home of the parachute regiment in my constituency, and the 1 or 2 countries around the world, I think that they could probably go in at breakfast and be home in time for tea, and have substantially improved the quality of democracy in that country. But I think it is quite, it's not a role in my view that NATO should be performing. It's a distraction. As far as the Christopher Marshall's point about burden sharing is concerned, I think this goes to the heart of our problems at the moment with declining budgets, with domestic pressures. There's no doubt that there are countries, as Liam was saying yesterday, there are countries who are getting all the benefit of the insurance policy without paying the premium. And you can't make people, we're sovereign nations, accountable to our own electorates. You can't make people understand the value. But start thinking about it, because at the moment the pendulum has swung heavily towards the United States in terms of the burden. And we should be under no illusions about how much the United States did actually contribute to the Libyan operation. And we're now seeing this substantial cut in the United States, and US taxpayers are going to start saying, well, should we be asking our allies to do more? And all of a sudden, you could find in the United States a move in that direction. And that would come as a shock, I think, to people in Europe. And of course, at the moment, our attention is diverted by the debate about the euro itself. But I don't think that that sanctions personally will work. But I do think people need to understand, if you want to be a member of this team, if you want to be a member of this club, you are heavily reliant on one member of the club for funding your contribution and your protection.
James, if you can't buy water glasses without coming to an agreement, do you think that you'd be able to implement a system that would be able to mandate more contributions?
This is not sort of an official NATO position. I'll just give you my view. And I hinted at it before. I think we need to look at the Libya case from my point of view and imagine what the situation would have been, what the reaction would have been had it gone a different way. Had the US had to lead alone because nobody else was willing to, there would have been a massive outcry that this was a European principally a European problem right across the lake, and yet once again the US had to lead. The reaction would have been terrible. And if the Europeans had gone alone and the United States had been left out of it, it would have been a massive criticism. Again, NATO was finished, the US had pulled out. The US had always called on its European allies, especially for operations that are close to home, to take a greater leadership role, a shared leadership role. And so the US didn't always have to be first. That's exactly what happened. And actually, I think from my contacts with the American government and the Secretary Generals at a higher level, they're pretty satisfied with the way it went. They're concerned about capabilities, but not about the leadership or the shared leadership of the operation, and I think we should be satisfied about it as well. I also must say I fall more into the view of our German colleague. You have to look at NATO's operations in totality, not just that one for that those period of days. Look at Kosovo, look at Afghanistan, where there are 5,000 Germans. Does the United States or Canada want to deploy 5,000 Germans to the north of Afghanistan? No, but we need them there. So everybody, if you look at the totality, to my view, is playing a part in a greater or lesser extent. They're paying the costs. But then we come to two niche areas. One is the command structure, and one is the shared capabilities. And I do think it is absolutely vital that for those two elements of NATO's package, it cannot be that everybody agrees to an operation and then selected countries say, but I'm not even willing to put my contribution into those aspects or to pay for the common costs. This is a red line where solidarity is called fundamentally into question. And then, of course, we aim for the greatest possible level of capability across the board and the greatest level of contribution, but I share the view that if we make the benchmark that everybody contributes to everything at exactly the proportional level of their GNP or I don't know what, you will make getting forward movement virtually impossible. Finally, just to add on the question of democracy, I share your view that NATO is not a democracy-creating organization, but we do have a niche capability, and that is that we can help build defense institutions that are democratically accountable and transparent. Of course, the Central and Eastern Europe countries, we helped them, or NATO helped them through that process, and now we've made that capability available, for example, to our partners south of the Mediterranean. If they want to build new defense structures that are more democratically accountable, we can do that for them if they ask. But there I do agree, that's where it stops.
Bruce, I know you wanted to say something on this.
Yeah, I agree on sort of peer pressure and shaming to get people to share their responsibilities and burden sharing. But if we look at history, Germany was invited to join NATO before Germany had an army. Spain was invited just because Franco died. It was social promotion. We've never had a criteria that says, NATO is a military expression of a community of shared values, not shared checkbooks. It doesn't say anything about that. So, you know, this has to be decided. If a NATO ally doesn't feel that they have a stake or wants a different kind of stake, Slovenia only has one helicopter, so it's unrealistic to say that they're going to do helicopter operations, but they did contribute in other ways in Libya. So I think it really is a come as you are and come what you want to bring. I mean, we can put pressure on, and I think soldiers do that to each other all the time to share the responsibilities, carry the pack. But there's nothing in the founding document that says that they have to.
I'm going to go to the audience. I'm going to take a few questions because we are starting to run out of time, and I want to get in as many questions as we can. I'm going to ask everyone to keep it as concise as possible, starting with the two gentlemen over here and then moving to the center. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Martin Klings of the German weekly Die Zeit. Just a short question. NATO is mainly a transatlantic partnership, but do you see, as the United States declare the 21st century of the Pacific, that you see shifts also in NATO strategies? And could you imagine like countries like Australia going to join NATO in the future and having a shift of strategies and policies? Thank you.
Yes.
I want to get back to Chicago for a minute, Jack James from Washington, and ask about how you might want to sell the product as opposed to being in the College of Cardinals when you're finished. How are you going to sell this to the larger public? Let me remind you of something that was said in February of 2010 by a guy named Gates. He says, the beauty of the BlackBerry, right? The demilitarization of Europe, where large swaths of the general public and the political class are averse to military force and risks that go with it, has gone from a blessing in the 20th century to an impediment to achieving real security in the 21st. Do you believe that to be the case? And if you do, how are you going to make the case in Chicago beyond what we've talked about in terms of money, in terms of commitment, in terms of capabilities and cash? How are you going to make it to the general public at large?
Yes, we had a question right in here.
Yes, Peter Jennings from the Australian Defence Department. I don't think we're actually applying to join, but we are very happy to cooperate. My question of the panellists is, at the NATO summit in 2012, is there scope or purpose behind the idea that NATO should discuss the defining strategic issue of our generation, which is the rise of China as a global power? And if it were of interest to NATO, what should the nature of that discussion be? Should NATO seek to build connections with China in some way, you know, beyond what I guess happens already, which is the, you know, visits of the occasional PLA delegations. But, you know, is there room for NATO to actually take a position on this defining strategic issue?
We're going to take one more question and then go to our panel.
Dov Zakheim, Washington. I'd like to actually pick up on the theme that has just been raised and tie it into the question of contributions. Aren't you worried that in practice, the United States may be voting with its budgetary feet, in that the greater the focus on Asia and the greater the pressure on budgets, the more likely it is that there will be less of a presence and less of a financial commitment to Europe, which troubles those who care about Europe. But that brings me to my question. You know, Bruce, it's all very nice to say we shouldn't measure in terms of dollars, but the American voter and the American taxpayer and the American budgeteer are clearly measuring in terms of dollars. Why shouldn't the Europeans do the same?
Well, I think Dov's absolutely right, and I think this does go to the heart of the debate about burden sharing, and that's why I said that earlier on that I think that on the continent of Europe we need to be to understand very clearly that the United States is just as much a sovereign nation state as anybody else, and subject to the same domestic pressures as we all are on the continent of Europe and in the United Kingdom. So it is, I think, a very, very serious issue. And if we suddenly found the United States turning back to a period of isolationism, that would be a very serious wake-up call to the Europeans. And in the United Kingdom, despite the huge financial pressures that we faced, one of the things that we were determined to do was to maintain our expenditure at the NATO commitment of 2% of GDP. You know, we've made that a priority. We've got the same kind of domestic financial problems as many other countries. But that's a priority we've made. That priority is available for other countries to choose. So, you know, I think that you make a very important warning. As far as including Australia and NATO, I think the Australians made a fantastic contribution in Afghanistan. Thank you very much indeed. I think it just proves that NATO is an organization which has the capacity to bring in others. We brought Australia's come on board in Afghanistan, and we know about Libya, where we have 3 Arab countries and a neutral European country coming on board as well. So I think that I would not be in favor of extending membership as far as Australia, not because I don't like the Australians, but for all the reasons I've just given. And the final point, I suppose, is the rise of China. No, I don't think that's... Yes, we all need to be aware of China. And clearly, I'm sure James can invent another committee, a subcommittee of NATO, or perhaps reassign so that we don't create further bureaucracies. We reassign a bureaucracy to look at China. Clearly, for the Pacific, China is a very important issue.
Bruce.
Well, I hate to disagree with my friend Dov and Jack on the budgetary issues. I have a different view of Gates's statement. Telling the Europeans to spend more on discretionary spending is the closest thing I've ever heard to rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. It's the one thing you know they're not going to do. And to lay that as a predicate for strategic planning, I think is absurd. If you look at the revaluation of other assets in our societies, our Wall Streets, our banks, just take Goldman Sachs, it's lost 50% of its valuation in the last, since 2008. Strategic planning, and this is James's job, is to really think about defending the West with 50% of the real budget over the next decrements. I mean, Panetta was using code word. He doesn't tell you how far he's going to cut because he doesn't know. We're going to have to basically do realignments of missions, reapportionment of forces, and also I think there are non-budgetary ways to increase the power of NATO. Knocking down the door to the EU to allow NATO to coordinate directly with the political community of 450 million people does massively increase your power and might allow us to move missions down from NATO to the capabilities of the nation states of Europe or in certain kinds of missions. So I think we've got to challenge people in Chicago to be creative and revolutionary and look at things in new ways rather than saying, God, if I had, every soldier in the world wants more money. That's just the nature of the game. But that's not what combat and defense is all about. It's doing more with less. And this is clearly the challenge for Chicago.
James.
Thanks. Well, I must say, I personally feel Secretary Gates was maybe being a bit gloomy on that day. I think first because, you know, we have to start from, you always have to decline from the main point. The main point is Europe and North America still have enormously capable military forces who are extremely well integrated in great numbers with a lot of high technology and a lot of money still going into it. We're not at zero. And as I mentioned, we have and are going to be bringing back in more and more numbers forces that have been through the most extreme boot camp there is. Very capable, very able to work together. And the cost of that will ramp down. So I think we shouldn't be starting from a position of too much gloom. And secondly, as we discussed, we have people out there working on ways in which to have multinational projects, figure out role specialization. So there's a lot of work going on, and I think we'll probably get there. But that does raise this point about the Pacific and the shift to the Pacific, the shift in the U.S. focus to the Pacific. There hasn't really been a substantial debate in NATO about shifting focus to the Pacific, and I don't think that's really going to happen anytime soon. NATO is a Euro-Atlantic organization. That's the center of gravity, and there's still a lot of work to be done there. But what is clear to me is two things. One is that, as I said before, the political and military presence of the United States in Europe is essential. And the U.S., in building missile defense through Europe, and not simply through bilateral arrangements with European countries, has demonstrated that it understands that too. And I can assure you, in discussing with U.S. administration officials the Chicago summit and smart defense, they don't see smart defense as being, you Europeans build your stuff on your own and we'll tell you how you did. They see smart defense as, we will work together across the Atlantic with our Canadian and European allies to build projects together. So they are designing it to bring people together, and not simply as a sort of test of loyalty. But there is also, how do we reach out to the Pacific? And this relates to Australia, relates to China in different ways. I think using Australia, if I can mention Australia, as an example of how our partnerships have deepened. 3 years ago, the Australian representatives at the NATO table would complain in a very Australian way, which is, you know, pretty blunt, about being left out of the decision-making process. We send forces and you don't let us shape the decisions or decide on anything. We're not mercenaries. And we totally changed the way we do business in NATO because of Australia and New Zealand in a way that no other organization has ever done. When forces from partner countries are contributed to a NATO-led mission, that country is at the decision-making table immediately, developing the plans, shaping the decisions, endorsing the decisions. So Australia is an example of how, for us, of how partnership has totally changed in a very positive way. When it comes to China, we don't see China as a threat. I think that point needs to be brought clearly from the NATO table. We are developing a relationship with China, which China also wishes to develop with us, but they always use the expression step by step. They're very cautious. And we don't want to push it any faster than they want to go. But of course, I think we all share the aim that as China comes into the international system, they come into the rules-based system and engage with us through the peaceful mechanisms that we have evolved, and we have to build new ones to accommodate them as they get bigger shoulders. And that's working fine from a NATO point of view, but as I said, in a very modest way and step by step.
Minister McKay has a question here right in the front, and he's got a microphone coming up right behind him.
Thank you very much, and to the panelists, this has been great, timely, and informative. My question goes to, I guess, what you could call the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Which
I
one
have
of
a
us
question
is...
about. It's not. I'm not describing you folks, and you can you can apply these as you choose. The good, the bad, and the ugly. My questions are about Russia, about the EU, and about the budgets. And you're right, James, to point out that this is very much about the core capabilities of the Euro-North American or South Canada relationship, as I like to call it. I think we still have a lot of work to do in sorting out the NATO EU missions. I think there is still a great deal of confusion as to who takes the assignment, and obviously in a time of austerity, choosing how these missions are carried out to avoid overlap, to avoid duplication, critically important as we go through a fairly painful process at the national defense budgets of all our countries. So avoiding that duplication, I think, is critical in the exercise. By the way, there is other countries that do want to join the organization, and I'm of the open door view as well. Bruce would know that a country like Macedonia, which was denied even entry into the process, and I don't know that the Greeks have the same moral authority to keep them out now. Russia is another relationship that we have had more than a spotty relationship, and in fact, at times has been the raison d'etre for NATO. And we have, in recent years, tried to engage again. So I just wondered if the panelists would like to comment a little bit on Russia. And the final question, I guess, is a little bit of a provocative one. Given the experience coming out of Libya, and Afghanistan for that matter, and burden sharing, we had a strikers group when it came to the NATO mission. And panelists were right to point out the contributions of non-NATO countries was critically important. The Arab nations in Libya, Australia, New Zealand, others, even Mongolia contributed to what we're doing in Afghanistan. And I think that speaks to the importance of partnerships. But my question is NATO ready to, or should they be ready to, discuss a Security Council type arrangement within their organization that allows for the vetting of missions? Thank you.
Minister, would you like to kick off with a response to your fellow minister?
Yes, I would. I'd first like to thank Peter very much indeed for having organized this forum. I think it's been a huge success. It's been very enjoyable, and I particularly like the informal fashion. So often you go to these things and you get formal presentations, and you're asleep by after the first 5 minutes. So this presents us with an opportunity for a much more lively debate and a much more interesting interchange. The good, the bad, and the ugly. Yeah, don't invite me to say which I think, because some of those are all three, but certainly two of them anyway. Let me take the NATO-EU issue first and foremost. Since we came into office last year, we've been absolutely explicit on this, that NATO is the cornerstone of the defense of Europe. That is a view that is held very strongly in the United Kingdom. And as I have attended all the EU defence ministers' meetings since we came into office last year, for some reason Liam didn't want to go. Liam, would you like to explain why you didn't want to go? Because I can't imagine. But anyway, so I've done all those, and it's been very interesting. I think that with my colleague from Slovenia here, I think that we would agree that there has been a much greater recognition in the past 18 months that the attempts by the EU to duplicate NATO would not only be a waste of resources, but would also undermine NATO itself. And so I think that message has really got through. As far as the missions are concerned, the EU has three missions. One just is additional to the NATO mission, off the anti-piracy off the Horn of Africa. Well, they're a bit short of ships for that one. They have a mission in Bosnia where they cannot even... We have 2 million men under arms in Europe, and we cannot find 2,200 soldiers for Bosnia in Europe's backyard. You've got to ask yourself, how serious are people about common defense if we cannot contribute such a modest number of people? We're down to 1,300. Potentially down to 1,200 for a 2,200 commitment. And then we have an operation in Uganda where an EU mission is training Somali soldiers, and apparently we couldn't find one European medic to support the EU trainers. Get real. If you want to take part in these things, make them work. So I think that that is absolutely critical, that whatever the EU does, it does not serve to undermine NATO. Russia, I think, is a fascinating country. For a year, I worked for a small Russian combat aircraft manufacturer called Sukhoi, and it was a very interesting insight to see how they work. They just do not seem to have adjusted to the post-communist world, and I think it's very important that we do not ignore Russia, and that we do seek to reach out to them, however difficult they at times make that for us, and however much they do try to thwart us on some serious issues, and Iran is one of those. And finally, you said yesterday, Peter, that Libya is should not be a template for the future, and I agree with that. But it was a pretty good template. And I think one of the things that we've learned from Iraq, one of the things that British people feel about Iraq was the Iraq war, that there was no proper United Nations mandate. Now, the government of the day argued that was not so. The opposition, which we were part, sided with the government on that. But the great thing about the Libyan operation was a very clear United Nations Security Council resolution. And I think that was, personally, I think that was helpful.
James, I'm going to go to you next, and I'd ask you to also make these, if you can, your closing comments, which is the perfect question, actually, to close on because we're running out of time.
Sure,
Thank you.
and thank you for that. On NATO-EU, there's been a very substantial evolution, which you, of course, have witnessed. I think 5 years ago, there was great nervousness in NATO and the United States about the EU getting too strong. Now, of course, our problem is we'd like the EU to be stronger. There is no ambiguity in NATO. We would like the EU to be a strong and capable organization, including in the security field, as long as there is no duplication or overlap. That requires good staff-to-staff contacts, political level contacts. That has its complications right now, as you know, and we need to go past that. But my own feeling is that we needn't be too concerned about too much overlap in the missions. The organizations are so different in terms of their level of capability. And to give one example, you don't take on a mission, even if it's modest, if there's a real chance that it might escalate beyond what you could handle. And NATO, of course, can escalate very much farther than the EU. So geographically, in terms of the scale of the mission and the types of missions, I think there's a relatively natural division of labor, which we're not really experiencing right now, but we do hope that the EU gets stronger. On Russia, we have by far the most profound cooperation with Russia than we do with any other NATO partner, and we demonstrated our commitment to that relationship by creating committees, lots of committees, NATO-Russia committees, all over the building. That's a sign of love in NATO. And if you look at what we do, especially on Afghanistan, transit, training of counter-narcotics officials, providing helicopters and trainers, we have airspace cooperation. I could go on and on. Everything works well, except missile defense. And of course, the Russians are looking at the whole range of our cooperation through the prism of missile defense. I personally feel that we will get there. And we'll get there because the Russians are concerned that NATO missile defense shouldn't undermine their strategic deterrent. We understand that. And the point is, NATO missile defense cannot undermine their strategic deterrent in terms of numbers, in terms of capability, in terms. So with that as the basis, I'm sure we'll get there. Though I said this on Russian media, and then the Russian ambassador criticized the, and I quote, groundless optimism of the experienced NATO propagandist. That was me. So, you know, he also has his own views on this. Finally, of course, NATO can take decisions on its own. I don't know if you were referring specifically to the UN or within NATO, some kind of a smaller group. Something analogous to the Security Council on the UN. Inside. So the group that contributes takes the decisions. This comes back to the question that was raised earlier. My own view is that's a very, very tricky road to follow. I'll give an example of Greece. You mentioned Greece during the Kosovo War. For them, this was enormously difficult to agree that any kind of NATO military operation would take place there against Serbs. And basically they, in the Security Council, you'd call it abstained. They didn't oppose. If we create now new inner circles, I have difficulty imagining the politics working very well. This is not good, but like democracy, I think it's better than any alternative.
Bruce, the final word goes to you quickly, please.
I want to come back to Minister McKay's good questions on what's going on with the 3-year Greek hold on Macedonia. Why are we going so slow on Montenegro? Why were the contingency plans for the Baltic states delayed for 5 years out of mistaken sensibility towards Russia's views? And we have a series of things that should be warning indicators that we should want to discuss. I'm sure there's a good answer from this experienced propagandist here. I just want to hear it. You know, I know this is normal, but I think a shareholder invested in this company is like, is this the way it's supposed to work? I mean, isn't the Turkish military or navy going the wrong way if they're going to Cyprus or Gaza? Is that supposed to be happening in NATO? Or are we discussing it? I just think that looking back on the last decade, we had a pageantry summit in '99. We had another pageant in Prague in 2002. We had a celebration in Turkey in 2004. We had a disaster in Bucharest, and nobody knows what happened in Lisbon. Now, I think there's a danger to go to Chicago and think it's a good election year event. We just don't want to do content. We want to just do the balloon drop. It seems to me that in a period of austerity, this is the time we should really, because we support NATO, because it's the most important organization we have, then it's worth basically doing the wire brush treatment and really getting down and forcing our leaders to work hard. That's sort of my argument.
Thank you very much to our panelists today for a very interesting and informative discussion. We appreciate it.